Hello, welcome to my third video, Understanding Syntax. Today I will try to unify what I did in the previous two videos. They had, as we will see in a moment, a slightly different approach. Let me start with a sentence according to video 1. This is what you generally see in Linguistics 101. So we start the sentence with the S symbol at the top, and then we have the famous subject noun phrase, let's say the man. All those examples generally are not brimming with fantasy, so this is likely to be a man. If a dog is in it, his name is likely to be Fido. Then we have the verb phrase. Let's say take a transitive verb such as kick. And the verb phrase in turn consists of the verb and another noun phrase. In this example, I will be using a noun phrase with an adjunct. Once again, the standard thing, the preposition phrase. Is in the garden, and as you already know, this structure means that the ball is in the garden, not that the kicking takes place in the garden. If the kicking took place in the garden, I would join the prepositional phrase here. Okay, so all the so-called nodes, this one, this one, this one, this one, they have something in common. A prepositional phrase has a P as the head, a noun phrase has an N as the head, a verb phrase has a verb as the head, but there is one odd man out. And that is S itself. The topmost node curiously seems headless, and it's different from all the other ones. And this is something that I will change during this video, namely by looking at sentences such as this one. The man has kicked. I'm now introducing an auxiliary. And if we look at more complicated sentences such as this one, we will see that one thing always stays the same, namely the tense of the sentence. When took the event place? That's always realized immediately after the subject. And the same is true for another feature that we find in English sentences, much more prominent in German sentences, but in English sentences we have agreement with the subject in terms of person and number. This is the famous third person singular, S. Okay, so starting from this observation, we can build a sentence structure that is a bit different from what I have suggested before. And the sentence structure that I'm now building, at least at the top of the tree, has the additional advantage that it conforms to the X-bar scheme that I introduced in video 2. We will replace the previous verb phrase that just consisted of the verb and the object with a verb phrase that consists of the verb together with an object, which gives us X bar. And we add to this the subject, namely the man. And as you can easily see, this conforms to the X-bar scheme. On the one hand, we have the complement of the verb kick, which has the closest relation to the verb. And then we add a subject to the result. And we say this part, kick the ball in the garden, is predicated of the subject, the man. All within the verb phrase. Okay, where does tense fit into this picture? Well, guess what? It fits into the picture by building another X-bar structure. Namely, we now switch back to the version where we have an auxiliary. And it is clearly visible that tense has to be realized here. And we also need to modify the verb form as the man kicked the ball. And on top of that, we build a tense phrase and now we only have one additional thing to do, namely we have to move the noun phrase, the man, from the specifier position of the verb phrase to the specifier position of the tense phrase. And this also yields us the right word order. The man has kicked the ball in the garden. It's only that the man has undergone a movement. Okay, so this could appear like an empty glass bead game, so you move stuff around, but we will discuss both the evidence and the reasons for this movement in later videos and in our sessions. Okay, so we have now achieved two things. We have transformed the previous verb phrase, which only consisted of a verb and a complement, into an X-bar structure, and we have changed S into an X-bar structure, which we now call tense phrase. We could also call it agreement phrase. As you know, both agreement and tense have to be realized here. But that's just a matter of terminology. So this already goes a long way towards unification of X-bar structure and the sentence structure in Linguistics 101. Let me now go to something not altogether different. we are now calling the thing previously known under the name sentence, tense phrases. But especially if we look at embedded sentences, we know that tense phrases alone, sentences consisting of a subject, and verb, and an object, are not enough. So if I say, I also need something else, which linguists have come to call complementizer, because the complementizer introduces an embedded sentence as the complement, let's say, of a verb. So one could say, he said that the man has kicked, and so on and so forth. And introducing the complement is the function of the complementizer. So this is something that we find in embedded sentences, and as you know, in English we can often delete the complementizer. He said the man has kicked, that's fine. In German you cannot do that. Er sagte, dass der Mann es getan hat. You can't delete the das like you can in German, in English. Okay, but it turns out that this position above the TP is also important in main clauses. So, for example, if I pose a question, we already know from the very first lessons that what we do if there is an auxiliary, we move it to the front. And previously we asked what kind of position is that, and the simplest assumption is that it's the same position that is used in embedded sentences to place the complementizer in. That is, it's the complementizer position. And so we have the beginnings of yet an additional phrase. And now comes the clincher, namely this is a yes-no question. But as we know, we can also pose different questions, namely so-called content questions, or in English called WH questions, because they mostly, with the exception of how, contain a word which begins with WH. What, who, why, where, and so on and so forth. And if we pose such a question, we first replace the noun phrase we are questioning with an appropriate question word, if it's a thing, what, if it's a person, who. And we let the sentence undergo an additional movement and position it in the very front of the sentence. And what we can see here is that once again we get an X-bar structure with a complement. TP is the complement of C. Together they form C-bar. And if I pose a content question in addition to yes-no question, I move the word that is questioned to the specifier position of the CP. So this does several things. We had those structures previously, and what we then said, we always added another S. And now we have a name for it. When we pose a yes-no question, we move the auxiliary that carries tense and agreement to the complementizer position. And when we, in addition, move a content word, we move the content word or the content expression to the specifier of CP. And this is already the full sentence model, where we have not just VP as the semantic core of the sentence, but on top of that, we also have TP. And this also has a very important semantic consideration. One could say, well, tense is just an affix and not really important, but the tense of a sentence anchors the sentence in something as important as truth. So whether I say Roman Jakobson is a great linguist or Roman Jakobson was a great linguist, so the truth of a sentence depends on its tense. If I say he is a great linguist, that's not true, has not been true since 1982 when he died. So tense seems insignificant, but in terms of semantics, it's not. On top of that, we have CP, and one could also say, well, complementizer, that's just a tiny function word, and complementizer in this case is just a position where another element is moved to. But the complementizer phrase is also important in terms of something that we have started to deal with in class, namely sentence types. And that's something with which I want to close this third video. I also think in terms of content, it's enough stuff that I've now tried to introduce. So, as you know, sentences can be declarative, they can be interrogative, which is something which I have just introduced. They can be exclamative, and finally they can be imperative. And imperative is actually something that we discussed in class. So say, come into Garden. But as we will see in a moment, we are not yet ready to deal with the imperative. But we can make a few remarks, tentative ones, about declarative. So the declarative sentence in English has no openly realized complementizer. So the main clause would be the man has kicked and so on and so forth. And in the embedded sentence, we have the complementizer that. In yes-no questions, the interrogative must be filled by something, but not by a complementizer, rather by a moved auxiliary. And in content questions, the specifier position of the complementizer phrase must also be filled. In embedded questions, we have complementizers such as if, or whether instead of that. In exclamatives, we have the following structure. And we can see, if we analyze that, and I will also do this in writing, that in exclamatives we have the specifier position of the CP filled with the WH element, and the C position itself is empty. So we have a full typology of declaratives, interrogatives, and exclamatives in terms of how the CP on top of the sentence is filled. And we can't do that yet with as simple a sentence as the imperative, which is why I will shift the imperative to a fourth or a fifth video. And that's already it for today. As far as the imperative is concerned, in terms of old-fashioned sentence structure with S on top of S on top of S, I have made a tree for you, and you may recognize this quote. It's actually the translation of a very famous, originally German quote, but we can discuss in class what this is supposed to mean and where it comes from. So thanks for now. I guess this was a lot of stuff, but I will add to this in writing, and I'm looking forward to the fourth video.